Hello, and welcome to another webinar of the Center for Studies in Higher Education. I'm Anne McLachlan, a senior researcher here, and am very glad to be hosting this particular presentation. I want to introduce our speaker, who is discussing who will be discussing the issues of class in doctoral education and what Berkeley may be doing to improve the environment for those from a less elite background. Timothy Hampton is the Aldo Scaglione and Marie M. Burns Distinguished Professor of Comparative Literature and French at the University of California. I also would add he's actually quite a bit more. He's worked as a translator. He's published in many different fields. He studies the Renaissance, so I guess he's taken that as his inspiration. He's also the past recipient of the Campus Distinguished Teaching Award in 2022, delivered the Martin Meyerson Berkeley Faculty Research Lecturer as well. A former director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities, he is a senior fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study in Paris and the Dahlem Humanities Center in Berlin. His most recent book is Cheerfulness, a Literary and Cultural History. He is, as he has on his bio, a graduate of Aztec High School and the University of New Mexico. So welcome, Professor Hampton.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I'd like to thank Anne McLachlan and Shanshan Jong Bitten for inviting me to talk to you today and for setting up this event. I'd also like to offer a shout out to the Townsend Center for the Humanities, which picked up the notice and helped to circulate information about it. Some of what I'm going to present today is an expanded version of an essay that I published recently in a magazine called Inside Higher Ed. Another part is from a memoir that I've been working on about social inequality in higher education. I've been trying to find a vocabulary to describe how my own experience as a student, teacher, and scholar intersects with the humanities as they are currently imagined. Today I'll be talking about graduate study. In my talk today, I want to do three things. First, I'll speak somewhat anecdotally about my own experience as a working class public school educated student who made it to an elite graduate school and somehow came out alive. Then I'll share with you some data about how we frame graduate study in my own field, which is the humanities. And finally, I'll try to propose a shift in perspective that might help us open new ways of thinking about graduate education at a top public university like Berkeley. But first, I want to share an epigram from the 19th century French traveler Alexis de Tocqueville in his famous book, Democracy in America. Here's what de Tocqueville says. He says, quote, "From the beginning, the originality of American civilization was most clearly apparent in the provisions made for public education," end quote. So for Tocqueville, democracy and public education go hand in hand, and together they shape national identity. So now I'll read a bit from something I've written and interrupt myself to improvise a bit as I go. When I was in my first semester of study for the PhD, I met a famous professor. I was at Princeton University, the only working class public university educated student in my program in comparative literature. I had slipped into the Ivy League through a side door after some time at the University of Toronto, where I worked on an MA until my mentors left for greener pastures and suggested that I should leave as well. Before Toronto, I had grown up on the wrong side of the tracks in a tiny town in the New Mexico desert, a town dominated by Pentecostals and members of the John Birch Society. I left home the day after high school, worked in the construction trade, studied at the State University in Albuquerque, and then worked some more. At Princeton, I was an older student, married, and my department chair knew that I owned a car. So he dispatched me to the Princeton Junction train station to pick up the famous professor who was coming to town from another Ivy League campus to give a distinguished lecture. The famous professor immediately recognized me. I had applied to his program the year before from Toronto, and been accepted, but had chosen instead to come to New Jersey to complete my studies. He revealed that my rejection of his program's offer of admission had taken the faculty somewhat aback. They had assumed that I would join them and were looking forward to having me as a student. Their program was more famous and cutting edge than Princeton's was, and anyone who rejected them, he hinted, must be a fool. I muttered something about needing a fellowship to survive, but he belabored the topic, bragging and shaking his head in disbelief at my folly. Finally, in a rare moment of self-assertion, I pushed back. You know, I said, you won't remember this, but I applied to your program once before, 3 years ago, from my home in New Mexico. You turned me down. I'm still the same person now that I was then. He leaned over and put his hand on my arm. Listen, Tim, he said, lowering his voice even though we were alone in the car. We can't let people like that into our program. We don't even know them. Who are their teachers? We don't even know those people. For me, this conversation was soul-crushing. I came from one of the poorest and most isolated spots in one of the poorest states in the country. In that moment, all I could think of were my college friends from similar backgrounds who had wanted to go to graduate school and who, despite excellent grades and laudable ambition, couldn't get into top programs. I had slipped past the gatekeepers, not because I was exceptional, but because I was stubborn. My friends, on the other hand, were the ones my guest had just called people like that. This painful encounter with the bleak snobbery of elite education has been much on my mind in recent months. Since the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in university admissions, the question of who studies where has been much discussed. Many selective colleges have moved away from required standardized testing, though some of them are now moving back, and some private universities are even rethinking the baleful tradition of legacy admissions for undergraduates on the assumption that this will somehow result in a fairer admissions process. Moreover, recent research by the Opportunity Insights Group at Harvard University, featured in the New York Times, has shown that the mere fact of family wealth vastly improves one's chances of being admitted to an elite college. In the United Kingdom, a similar study, featured in The Guardian, found similar correlations between family wealth and elite education. Yet none of these conversations adequately addresses the situation of the humanities, which is my own area of focus. For students in the humanities, the career trajectory is more complicated than it is in many other fields. The move from undergraduate study to professional success is less direct than it is in the sciences, engineering, or even the social sciences. Students who want to pursue careers in the humanities as professors, researchers, archivists, librarians, journalists, curators, or even lawyers inevitably have to move from the BA through some type of graduate study. For these students, the crucial juncture in their career paths isn't where they go to college, it's where they go to graduate school. This means that the current debates over access and fairness in university admissions miss a pivotal link. That link is my focus today. As we know, the University of California has worked hard over recent decades to diversify its undergraduate population. It proudly and rightly showcases the successes of racial minority students and those coming from modest economic backgrounds or immigrant families. Yet, how well do graduate programs in the humanities and arts serve these communities? My observation and research suggest that they don't do a very good job at all. Some of my impressions are, again, anecdotal. When I began teaching at UC Berkeley several decades ago, the departments in which I was appointed and where I often helped out with feedback on applications, so some 4 or 5 departments, routinely admitted new graduate students from a wide variety of undergraduate institutions. These ranged from other UCs to public research universities and teaching schools, exclusive private institutions, and small liberal arts colleges. In recent years, I've noticed that the range of students we admit has become much narrower. To test out my impressions, I recently began developing a data-based picture of our arts and humanities applicant pool, and, more important, of the institutions where successful applicants to Berkeley for graduate study did their undergraduate work. I requested data on graduate admissions at 3 top University of California campuses, including Berkeley. I wanted to know where applicants to our graduate programs in the arts and humanities applied from and who gets in. Thanks to the generosity and hard work of staff at Berkeley, UCLA, and UC Irvine, I received stacks of figures going back several years. If you care about opportunity in education, it makes for depressing reading. For example, in the application pool for the 2018-19 academic year, the students admitted to Berkeley's excellent graduate humanities and arts programs were overwhelmingly from elite private institutions. Out of 79 who applied to Berkeley from other campuses in the UC system with a bachelor's degree or equivalent, only 5 were admitted. Our sister system, the Cal State University system, which often feeds the top UCs with excellent undergraduate transfers, generated 41 applications for graduate humanities study. 1 student was admitted. Among the 26 applicants from the Cal State system who already had master's degrees and who were therefore presumably better prepared and more experienced, a bit as I was when I went to Princeton, of those 26, only 1 was admitted. Further afield, the record was just as bad. Out of 70 applications from students who earned undergraduate degrees at 8 top flagship state universities around the country, University of Colorado at Boulder, Michigan at Ann Arbor, North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Texas at Austin, Indiana at Bloomington, Washington at Seattle, Wisconsin at Madison, and the State University of New York at Binghamton, of those 70 applicants, only 6 were admitted to graduate study at Berkeley in the arts and humanities in 2018-19. By contrast, if you went to Yale University, where the current tuition is $65,000, your chances of being admitted to graduate study in the humanities at Berkeley in 2018-19 were about 1 in 2. Applicants from Brown, where the current tuition is $65,000 plus, had just about a 1 in 3, a little bit over a 1 in 3 chance of admission. While it's true that applicants from some of the Ivy League schools did strike out, there was one school that was 0 for 9, applicants from Harvard University, where tuition is $55,000 plus, went about 1 in 3, with 5 of 16 applicants gaining admission. One private Midwestern liberal arts school, Kenyon College, where tuition is $69,000, sent 5 applicants, of which 3 were accepted. My reading of data from subsequent years revealed a situation more or less commensurate with the 2018-19 crop of applications I've just described. Of course, there were variations in the application pool. A year later, in 2019-20, Yale did worse, while Stanford University and Swarthmore College, both charging about $62,000 tuition every year, did better with 50% admit rates. But the contrast between expensive private colleges and public universities remained stark. Top public state universities were present, but did not fare particularly well. The 8 flagships mentioned above collectively placed 9 out of 54 applicants, better than the year before. Several UC campuses were shut out completely, including UC Riverside, Santa Barbara, and humanities-friendly Santa Cruz. And the Cal State system placed 1 student out of 36. The data I received from UCLA was less finely grained than the data I got from Berkeley, as I received information about applications, but not about who was accepted. However, my scan of bios of graduate students posted on 4 departmental websites, so in other words, I went the other way. Instead of looking at the data coming in, I looked at who was showcased as having been accepted. My scan of bios of graduate students posted on 4 departmental websites revealed that enrollments in some humanities departments, such as comparative literature and English, were shockingly tilted toward alumni of private colleges, while others, philosophy, interestingly enough, were somewhat more balanced between publics and privates. Meanwhile, my look at data from UC Irvine suggested that their humanities departments, in contrast to those at Berkeley, were more open to graduates from the Cal State system. They admitted 9 out of 44 in 2020. And yet also in 2020, Irvine's graduate humanities programs accepted 6 total students from UC campuses beyond UC, Berkeley, and UCLA, whereas applicants from Johns Hopkins, Princeton, and Yale enjoyed a 50% admit rate, and those hailing from the University of Chicago were admitted at 100%. My point here is that there's a blind spot in the national conversation about higher education, the humanities, and diversity. Whatever elite humanities programs may understand when they say diversity in the area of graduate study, it doesn't appear to include economic diversity, since elite institutions overwhelmingly favor the wealthy. The broader implications of this situation for public universities are worth considering. The striking exclusion of public university applicants, people like that, as my professor friend called them, from programs at universities like Berkeley means that a public resource, UC, is increasingly placed in the hands of students from private school backgrounds. When faculty in public universities complain about the privatization of the university, that famous phrase, this fact isn't usually what they have in mind, but perhaps it should be. There is, of course, a well-known history behind the progressive effacement of public university students from elite graduate education. The explosion of higher education after World War II, following the GI Bill, brought with it a massive expansion of enrollments in public universities. My own alma mater, the University of New Mexico, doubled in size in less than a decade. This was followed by the predictable reaction. The Reagan Revolution and the passage of Proposition 13 in California brought a counter-movement in which state legislatures all around the country began cutting back on funding for public education. This provoked a flight from public universities on the part of the upper middle class families who suddenly found that their desire for economic success outweighed any commitment they might have once had to the public good. And there came into being a frantic new marketplace of education in which students who in an earlier generation might well have attended public institutions now began stuffing their dossiers in order to get into so-called elite colleges. Tuition costs went up at the privates, encouraged by marketing campaigns and an industry aimed at producing what the philosopher Michael Sandel has called the tyranny of merit. The obsession with merit and achievement dovetailed with the attempt by privates going back as far as the presidency of James Conant at Harvard to break the hegemony of the WASP ruling class in elite schools. However, with the emergence of the new economy of achievement, poorer students, or students who for whatever reason were not disposed to leave their rural upbringings and head for the city, began simply turning away from higher education altogether. In 1970, only 5% more urban students than rural students earned bachelor's degrees. Today, the difference is 14%, almost triple what it was. This failure to support economic advancement in higher education did not go unnoticed. In his 1982 postscript to his famous book on the uses of the university, former UC President Clark Kerr, the architect of the UC system, remarks that one of the greatest failures of higher education in the 1960s and between the 1960s and the 1980s involved the failure to enroll more lower-income students. I quote Clark Kerr now, "It has been easier to change policies and practices and preferences that make distinctions on the basis of sex and race than on income group." End quote. As I'm suggesting, the effects of this failure are felt most brutally in the selection process for graduate study, where students have made their career choices, but for whatever reasons, cannot get the training they need to pursue them. These big trends in the history of higher education, which we're familiar with, of course, offer a context for my presentation, though they are not, of course, my focus, which, as I've said, is graduate studies in the humanities. I'm interested in the conduits and vehicles that remain for lower-income people to rise to excellent graduate education. In California, this includes principally the famous interlocking system of the community colleges, the Cal State campuses, and the UCs. But as I've suggested, the movement between those systems has increasingly become blocked, at least in the area of the arts and humanities, if not in the area of graduate education more generally. The reasons for the disfavoring of public university graduates are not hard to fathom. The unremitting pressure on public university budgets, the downsizing of graduate humanities programs by university administrations, and the squeeze placed on the arts and humanities in a difficult job market predictably lead graduate admissions committees to offer their few admission slots and their fewer fellowships to safe students who they know are well trained, that is, to students already in positions of privilege. And while the Ivy League student may well be excellent, she already enjoys the resources that a top quality graduate education aims to provide. Access to excellent faculty, training in sophisticated critical thinking, opportunities for research abroad, and so on. In the race for merit, the private school student can easily outclass the applicant from a Cal State or a land-grant college who may have spent her college years working. This means that those very students whose lives would be most dramatically changed by access to advanced training in the humanities are the ones being shut out. This is an unspoken feature of debates about educational opportunity. In my own case, to return to my fateful meeting with the famous professor, the issue was not whether I could go successfully from my public university in New Mexico to a top private in New Jersey and do competent work. The two professors I had worked with in Toronto both came from and returned to top private universities, and I had impressed them enough to receive their endorsement. Once I got to Princeton, I won an award for excellence and wrote a prize-winning thesis that became a prize-winning book. Perhaps I was exceptional, but I don't think so. I was simply someone who was given an opportunity, or more precisely, someone who was stubborn enough to demand an opportunity. Such opportunities, I've been suggesting, are life transforming for poor people and public university educated students. Part of the mission of a school like Berkeley should be to provide those opportunities for graduate students as much as we do for undergraduates. It matters that the imbalances I've been describing come about in the arts and humanities. These are fields that almost by definition study hierarchies of value, from the critique of aesthetic judgment to the constitution of canons of reading. Many STEM fields rely heavily on numerical criteria and other types of measurement to judge applications. The humanities are about discernment, and the failure of humanities faculty to discern the social hierarchies facilitated by their programs constitutes a failure of intellectual imagination. For the social hierarchies that shape the field, we now know, are deeply influenced by, or deeply inflected by economic privilege. It's disingenuous to pretend otherwise. The formula is clear. To get into a top program, you should go to an elite college. To go to an elite college, you should arrange to come from a wealthy family. Writers about university admission patterns often tiptoe around the topic of who gets into graduate school, on the assumption, I suppose, that this is a confidential matter, a matter of professional judgment. And of course, as we know, every candidate is different and every department is different. Yet no one who is taught at a top public university like Berkeley or in the Ivy League, as I have, seriously believes that students from elite private undergraduate institutions are uniformly better or stronger in some absolute sense, whatever that would be. They are simply slicker, more polished, at home in the jargon. Now, so far I've been sharing my thoughts about the current state of affairs in the study of the humanities at top public universities, at least to the degree that I've been able to do an analysis based on my own experience and a data-based sketch of the landscape. Now I'd like to hazard a thought about how we can rethink the situation. Much of the unfairness that I'm arguing distorts our approach to graduate education comes from the ways in which we evaluate applicants. In any given year, in the fields that I know, faculty meet to rank the dossiers of applications and usually to look at a sample of work. In the book-based or language-based disciplines, that includes looking at a writing sample. As universities have turned away from standardized testing as politically suspect, they've tended to place emphasis on writing, on the writing sample that we require from potential students, especially at the graduate level. And of course, given the choice between a brilliantly sophisticated essay drenched in the latest theory by a student from an elite private school on the one hand, and on the other hand, a solid but promising essay by a first-generation student from a state university, there's no doubt which student will be offered admission and a fellowship. The campus fellowship criteria virtually demand it. I've seen it happen dozens of times. The rituals of the so-called meritocracy, while claiming fairness, overwhelmingly privilege the already privileged. And such judgments are overwhelmingly class-based, even at the level of language. The student whose application paper is laced with phrases from another language or with slang from a particular ethnic group is understood to be colorful. The working class student whose paper is stiff or ungrammatical is just a bad writer. The fact that the private school graduate may offer a more polished writing sample than does the UC-trained student merely indicates the obvious point that the UC student, formed in a large public campus, receives less schooling in the tricks of academic writing. It doesn't mean that the public university-educated student has less promise or will go on to do less impressive work. It only means that he has a less polished writing sample. This focus on writing is emblematic of a mistake that we often make, and I'm taking it as emblematic of larger criteria in many different fields, and that is to fixate on the product of undergraduate education rather than on process. When we fixate on achievement, or to use again Sandel's phrase, the tyranny of merit, we reduce education to a kind of zero-sum game of point scoring or name dropping. And that's a game which private university graduates will always win. Indeed, our graduate students often bring dossiers of achievement to Berkeley that are truly astonishing. They've lived abroad, they've translated books of poetry, they've written novels, they've published articles in national magazines, they've collaborated with avant-garde filmmakers in Berlin, and so on. These are truly impressive things, and they are truly impressive at doing the kinds of things you can do if you have money and time on your hands. By contrast, the public university student working at 2 jobs and studying at a school where writing programs are consistently underfunded will offer a writing sample or a CV or a portfolio that is objectively less impressive. And yet, if we only focus on such markers, on the tokens of achievement, on what a student has done in the privileged cocoon of a private college, we're limiting our imagination of what graduate study should and could offer our students. And in a changing job market, one could even argue that the skills that a publicly educated student may bring, a certain resourcefulness, flexibility, tenacity, those skills should be as important as a slick writing sample. Our job, I would suggest, should not be to focus on the product of undergraduate education, but instead on the potential for growth through graduate study. We should begin to think more dynamically about graduate admissions, locating our students in a process of self-transformation and professional growth through education. Indeed, I would propose, in lieu of the language of meritocracy and achievement that, as Sandel and others have pointed out, is heavily class-biased, I would propose that we approach graduate admissions and graduate study in the humanities through the lens of what I would call navigation, a process of finding a path. I want to insert the idea of navigation into our thinking about graduate training. We should be looking not at what this or that candidate has achieved, that magic word, but at what a Berkeley education can help them discover. And if I were a policy-oriented type of guy, I'd even think that what we need is some kind of fellowship program that would target other UC campuses. In the case of some students, those who come from poor or rural backgrounds, this may require an extra commitment of time and mentorship on the part of the faculty. But such commitments have everything to do with Berkeley's status as a public university with internationally distinguished arts and humanities programs. For, as Alexis de Tocqueville reminded us in my epigram to this paper, education is essential to democracy and shapes our national identity. Otherwise, we are living in a bubble of privilege, chatting online with our colleagues in other bubbles about their bubbling students. If this is all we do as humanists, we shouldn't be surprised if our tax-paying neighbors wonder what we're up to. Now, I began this talk by mentioning my own adventures at Princeton University, and I left off the narrative with me trapped in my old station wagon on a back street with a famous professor. At Princeton, I was a clerical error, an exception, one of the people like that who don't belong. It's fairly obvious if you follow higher education that the patterns of exclusion evoked by my famous professor friend at elite private universities like his have not changed particularly, despite the rhetoric they spread around about now opening their doors to the less wealthy. They may indeed be taking a few less wealthy undergraduate students, but not students to do the PhD in the humanities. This makes it all the more important for Berkeley's programs to evolve into vehicles for social advancement, welcoming students from less elite backgrounds and other public universities in order to provide them with elite training. Because if we don't do it at Berkeley, no one else will. At the very least, we need to wake up to the broader social implications of our choices for admission to our programs. Such openness is crucial to the diversification of the professoriate and all professions, I would say, and to any claims that we might make about the relevance or public mission of our work. And finally, just to end the story, I can report that my encounter with the famous professor ended without drama. Following his expression of scorn for those people, the public school kids whom his elite program could not see its way to admit, I clammed up and concentrated on my driving. For his part, he seemed to sense that he had leaked one of the state secrets of the meritocracy. After all, he was sitting next to a peasant who had somehow slipped into the castle. So he softened his tone. He followed up his comment with a gentle expression of interest in my own trajectory. "So you went to the University of New Mexico," he said gently. "Now that's interesting. Is that the one in Tucson or the one in Phoenix?" That's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much. That was a most interesting talk. And pardon me for chuckling at the end. This is just extraordinary.
I've received several emails from friends who read an earlier version of this, and they said, "Did that really happen?" And I'm afraid it did.
Yes, well, just a small underline. I also, when I was a student at Berkeley, but one that didn't fit in very comfortably was sent to pick up in my very beat up 1961 Plymouth Valiant station wagon, the famous German professor from the airport, and experienced the same bizarre phenomenon. But I think my point is, and I really am very grateful to you for the graceful and broad perspective you brought to this issue and tied it back to our own institution, because this is really, I think, the problem. Who are we here at Berkeley? And what are we actually doing? That's another question,
Yeah.
which could be put in many different contexts.
Yeah.
But we do have a very specific question that was sent in for you, which I believe you have seen.
Yes.
That if we borrow the term first gen student, we arrive at two possible groups of students. One, students who are first gen for undergraduate and grad. Two, students who are only first gen for graduate school, but both parents went to undergrad. What challenges do you think these types of students might face compared to students whose parents also went to graduate and professional school?
That is a great question, and there are a couple of things I could say about it. One will go Well, first of all, one will go very specifically to the argument that I've been making here today, which is that we need to be more open to graduates of non-elite schools. One could certainly imagine a family in which the parents, let's say, went to Cal back in the good old days when there was no tuition, and went on to become uh, public school teachers or people working in social services, make a decent amount of money, but not a lot of money. And then when their kids grow up, their kids go to some public university, maybe not to Cal, but to some other public university, one of the other UCs, because those people have an investment in the University of California system from which they benefited. And then they suddenly find that those students can't get into a place like Berkeley to do graduate work. That must be a real shock to that generation of people. So that would be just the way in which this question sort of fits in to the kind of dynamic that I'm interested in. But I think the question is also a good one, that students, graduate school is a very strange phenomenon. It's miserable. I mean, let's face it. You're in a weird world between being an undergraduate where you don't care about anything except hanging out with your friends, and being an actual professional. And you never feel like you know enough, and you're generally depressed and trying to find ways to not do your work. So that was my experience of graduate school. But that does then raise the question of first generation students whose parents may have gone to college, but they don't come from a professional background. Those students have no idea where they're headed. And that seems to me, again, this goes to this idea of navigation that I was talking about, that one of the things we need to be doing, and I mean, there's a lot of talk also about alternative careers in the humanities, because the teaching careers have somewhat dried up. However we think about that, we really need to think about helping those students know where they are going and develop goals and a real sense for themselves. Because if your father was a professor and you're going to graduate school, you know what a professor does. I mean, when I went to graduate school, first of all, I had no idea that I would ever graduate. No expectation that I would ever graduate. And once I graduated, I had no idea how to negotiate the profession, how to figure out how to do the things that many of my colleagues knew how to do immediately because their parents were from professional backgrounds. So I think this is the kind of mentoring that we need to be doing, and those are the challenges. There's just often a sense for graduate students who don't come from professional backgrounds that they are kind of drifting, that they care very much about what they're doing and they think they know where they would like to end up, but the precise steps of how to get there are very hard for them to discern in some cases. So I think that's a place where we could really do a lot better job mentoring students, and where there really is a distinction between students from one demographic and versus another.
Thank you. Were there any other questions that were sent to you, Shanshan? Oh, is the elitism of some of the top privates not entirely the same as classism? Since I don't.
Yeah, I mean, since it says since some offer 100% aid to low-income undergraduates, I mean that's yeah. I mean, I think that's we could say that it's not entirely the same as classism, but it's still pretty much classism. Maybe not entirely, but in any case, I'm not really focusing. I'm not able to. I'm not particularly focusing on the undergraduate experience, because that's a
Right.
much different and much more complicated situation. I'm just really trying to think about this little sort of blip in the system that people haven't really talked about, haven't really noticed. That it's about the shifting of gears from undergraduate experience to graduate experience, and how does that work? And that's something we don't talk about. I mean, all of the press coverage you see about access in higher education is about undergraduates. And so my question is, who is then getting into graduate school and not? And the question was I able to see the income background for the elite institutions? The income background for the elite institutions candidates? No.
Mhm. But it's plausible to make assumptions.
I mean, certainly this group of people at Harvard, the Raj Chetty, led by this guy Raj Chetty, who was
Right.
actually here earlier this year. I mean, they've demonstrated pretty definitely that
Absolutely.
overwhelmingly people who go to elite colleges are from
Wealthy
economically
backgrounds.
more comfortable backgrounds, and that seems
Mhm.
to be. And in the UK, I read recently that scholarships and awards in the arts. 40% of them go to a demographic that attends 6% of the schools in the UK. So it's, I
Oh
mean,
my
kind of
goodness.
massive unbalance. So
Yes.
if you don't go to
Yes.
Oxford or Cambridge, you may want to immigrate somewhere.
Or Eton to
Yeah,
get
or
there.
Eton. If you don't go to Eton or
Yeah.
Dulwich, you may
Yeah.
want to join the army or something. I don't know what people do now.
Right.
My day,
Right.
one would have joined. I mean, where I came from, one would have joined. I should have joined the army. I was intended to join the army, except it was Vietnam, so I wasn't going to do it. But many of my high school friends went into the military. That was the
Mhm.
kind of normal trajectory. That was the kind of normal career trajectory for somebody who wanted to get out of the desert, was to join the army, go to the jungle.
Right. Although it could be noted that at the present time, with our so-called volunteer military,
Yeah,
that it is the children largely of the poor
yeah.
who are in the military
Yeah,
now.
I mean, it's overwhelming. It's children of the poor and children in particular of minorities.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
actually shocking what the voluntarization of the military has done. It's really incredible.
Yes. Indeed. Well, here is another question. It is commonly assumed that well, you can read it yourself.
It is commonly assumed that graduates from humanities have less chance of getting well-paid jobs compared to graduates from STEM.
Well,
Does that play a role in the increasing elitism of the humanities program? In other words, I mean, there are several ways which one can kind of flip that question. I mean, it's a great question. Um, as I said at one point, the I think a lot of the increasing elitism in graduate programs in the humanities comes from the kind of budgetary pressure on departments and on universities to cut back the humanities. I mean, as you know, in many universities now, the humanities are being eliminated altogether. The University of West Virginia, um, Miami of Ohio is involved in a kind of weird, which was always a kind of bright light in the humanities. It's a public university is involved in a kind of weird transition where they're sort of trying to phase out some of the humanities. So the pressure on the remaining PhD programs in the humanities is immense. So in that context, if you only have 3 people that you can let in or 5 people that you can let in, where are you going to, which candidates are you going to let in? And that's a problem which I think is felt palpably at Berkeley, at least in the kind of small departments that I work in, possibly not in some of the very large departments. But I mean, I can remember vividly having arguments with colleagues in my wonderful departments, my wonderful colleagues, about who we were going to let in, and they would say, well, this person went to Bryn Mawr, or this person went to wherever, Swarthmore, we have to let that person in. I would say, but what about this person from UC Santa Cruz? And we would inevitably make the offer to the person from Bryn Mawr, and the person from Bryn Mawr would inevitably go to Columbia, and in the old days, I think it's changed now, but in the old days we would then lose that position. So we had wasted a kind of opportunity to bring somebody from one of the other UCs. So I think the pressure on departments to downsize and to only take a few students has tended to winnow out students from slightly less privileged backgrounds. I should also say that I had an interesting, when I published this thing in Inside Higher Ed, I had an interesting exchange with somebody who wrote to me and said that she teaches in a kind of flagship public school in the Midwest, and she has many students who go from their small towns and working class backgrounds, mill towns and so on, and go into the military. And they do a tour in the military or two tours in the military, and they're off God knows where around the globe fighting for their country. And then they come back and they're incredibly motivated and incredibly focused and disciplined. And they zoom through undergraduate school with excellent grades, and then they want to go to graduate school, and they can't get into graduate school because they don't really fit the profile. I mean, somebody from some public school in the Midwest who spent 6 years in Iraq is not the same as somebody who just graduated from Amherst College. And so there's a sense that we really need to open things up. Okay, I've been sort of digressing, and I haven't really answered this other question, or the other version of this question that was just posed, which is, I'll read the question again. It's commonly assumed that graduates from humanities have less chance of getting well-paid jobs than compared to graduates from STEM. Does that play a role in the increasing elitism in humanities programs? So I guess the idea would be, what the questioner is suggesting, and this is, I think, an important thing to suggest, is that somehow inevitably the pressure on humanities programs and the increasing elitism in humanities programs means that, in the largest context, the humanities are turning into a kind of boutique operation. I mean, this is the way, this takes us back to, pre-World War II days. Who majored in the humanities? Well, people who came from very, very, very privileged backgrounds and had trust funds. I mean, there were always a few outliers and kind of strange renegades, and many of them went to art schools or went to public schools, and then sort of made their way into the world of letters or the world of art through alternative methods. But in the current context, we run the danger of ending up with a kind of educated humanities cohort that is sort of all pretty much from the same socioeconomic background, and that's not a good thing. I think we can all agree.
Mhm. Here's another question.
Yeah, so this says, if we don't focus on products, such as writing samples, in the graduate admission process, what are some of the better measures we could use? It's a great question as well, because needless to say, I offered a kind of critique of the writing sample without really offering too much of a solution. But I do think we need to think more broadly, more globally, in terms of the way in which we think of what students do, and possibly we have a tendency to judge those writing samples in a fairly blinkered kind of way. I mean, I read this paper, and does it look like something that fits in with my work? Okay, good. Well, let's let that person into the program. And I think we need to think about, we need to try and project where a student can go with our help. And that's why I used the word navigation. So that could be a possible measure. And I guess the other measure is just that as a public university, we should immediately be focusing our attention whenever we get a student from a good student applicant from another public university, from a UC or from one of the land grant colleges across the West. Those should be students we should be saying, aha, we want to see if there's any way we can get this person in and we can do anything to help this person. And if the person maybe has a few weaknesses, we'll help that person. So that's the way I would want to think of it, in a more kind of global, holistic way of thinking about education, about admission, rather than just simply focusing on, somebody who writes, an incredibly sophisticated essay influenced by European philosophy or whatever. So focusing also on what we can offer these people to sort of help them, right? I'm not hearing you, Anne. I sense that you're saying important things, but they're not coming through.
Oh, yes, I was muted. Sorry about that.
That's right.
Several things, actually, a multitude of things. But in response to what you just said, my understanding is that the Council of Graduate Schools are paying attention to, or it is paying attention to, this issue about socialization, because
Yeah.
it's not just the social cultural aspect, it is how many undergraduates, actually, regardless of where they went to their undergraduate school, are not prepared for the workload.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as a nation, we're very much concerned with how many people complete PhDs
Yeah.
that the state, in our case, has invested so much money in.
Yeah.
So I do believe that's being discussed. I also think that there's some glimmers of understanding amongst faculty here that that might be helpful. But at the same time, I have been very much taken with the notion of Bourdieu's cultural capital
Mm.
and the bias exhibited by so many professors
Yeah.
here and elsewhere, that if the student is somehow a little awkward, doesn't read the New York Times every day, has never seen an opera,
Yeah.
it's these subtle things about class, wealthy and privileged background, which makes a graduate student fit in
Yeah.
some departments.
Yeah.
And that is very disturbing. I mean,
Yes.
it may be human nature, although I don't want to talk about human nature to,
As a historian, yes.
but still, you want to admit someone into the tribe
Yeah.
who belongs there in your
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think that's extremely important, and I've had conversations with students, working class students whom we've admitted into our programs. One of the things I often do is seek them out and say, I come from a similar kind of background, and be in touch, and is there anything I can do? And on several occasions, people have come to me and said, I just don't know what I'm doing here. I mean, what the other graduate students seem to care about is not what I care about. What the faculty seem to care about is not what I care about. And I just can't quite figure out what I want to do. I know what I want to do professionally, but I just can't. But there's a whole kind of social ritual here that I
Exactly.
can't master. And it's like going to a party where you don't know what the social codes are. I mean, you're afraid you're gonna drop your drink or say something inappropriate to the hostess or the host or whatever, right? I mean, and I think that's something that we really need. I mean, it's great to hear that they're concerned about this and at the national level. We really need to be doing more to think about what it is that we care about and what it is that actually matters. I mean, I think that's
Yes.
really important. I mean, I remember being a graduate student at Princeton and just saying, who are these people? I mean, I felt like I was a kind of anthropologist who had been dropped in the in
Yes.
the in the in
Uh,
an alien tribe and try and figure out why this professor would say that to one of the students. I mean, I just could never get the codes in a certain kind of way. And I think what we need to do is to say, no, 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 this is what's really important. These are the things you need to do. This is
right.
what's really important for you. And it doesn't really matter if you don't show up or if you don't dress in black, or if you don't show up for the latest party. That doesn't matter. What matters is this. And this
Yes.
is, and that means we all need to kind of step back and kind of clear out a lot of the fog and the kind of social rituals around graduate education to think about what is the kind of training we want to give people and how can we get it to them. And that's what we should be giving to them.
Well, I completely agree, but the issue still remains
Yeah.
about the faculty.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I have myself given bias trainings,
Yes.
and for a while the institution made them mandatory
Yes.
for departments.
Yes.
But I personally didn't really observe much change,
Yes.
nor change in expressed and unexpressed attitudes
Yes.
or behavior.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is a major
Yeah.
challenge.
No, this is a challenge. This is a challenge, and we acknowledge that. I mean, I acknowledge certainly most of my colleagues come from upper middle class backgrounds or professional backgrounds. I mean, academia is a lot like, academia is in many ways like it's a guild where professor parents produce professor kids. I mean, it's like,
Yep.
it's like firefighters or undertakers. I mean, it passes from one generation to the next. And
Right.
that's good. I mean, it's all great. But that also means that we need to sort of open up. And I sense that there's some movement in some areas. I mean, I've had some colleagues who seem to me like they had no interest in talking to anybody who hadn't gone to one of two undergraduate institutions. But a lot of other faculty are much more open-minded, and I think that the whole the paradigm may be starting to shift, or the culture may be starting to shift. Certainly, it must be said that class is a difficult thing to talk about because it's not visible in the way that, for example, race is or ethnicity is. And I recently read a beautiful book by a writer named Sarah Smarsh called what's it called? I forget the name of it now. Which is a memoir about growing up on a farm outside of Wichita in the 1980s, and she was from a farming family, and she talks about going to university and how and she went on a special program devoted to low-income students. They called it the white trash program. She and her friends called it the white trash program. But she talks about being on campus and how strange that felt because everyone assumed that her parents were sending her money and that she came from an upper middle class background as they all did, and the fact that she had no money and she was trying to sell everything that was in her apartment and work at 3 jobs. I mean, those things are very, very difficult, and so class becomes a difficult thing to talk about because it can't be read easily.
Right. Right.
And people don't want to talk. Of course, people don't want to talk about class in the United States because, as George H.W. Bush once reminded us, there are no social classes in America. So that kind of and the notion that anybody can become a gazillionaire or whatever, whatever the kind of ideology is.
American myth.
But you're right. I mean that class is difficult to talk about, and so anti-bias training around class, it's really important for us to learn to think about these things, and change comes slowly.
Very slowly. Yes, yes. Well, my hope would be, or was actually, that there would be more first generation faculty.
Yes.
But precisely because of the phenomenon
Yeah.
of PhD recipients becoming
Yes.
more and more privileged rather than less,
Yes.
the faculty remains as privileged as they ever were.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's
that's
certainly been my case. I mean, I remember when I came to Berkeley, I thought, okay, this is great. Because I've been teaching at Yale, and I thought, oh, this is great. I'm coming to Berkeley, big public university. First of all, there are going to be a lot of working class kids, and they're going to be working class faculty, and there are a few, but nowhere near what I kind of expected. I must say that's the case.
Yes, yes. Well, actually, it was the GI Bill that
Yeah.
created PhDs from working class background,
Yeah.
but that generation has died away.
Yeah, no, it's true. And when I first came here, I used to talk. I used to go around and pick the brains of my older faculty members, mainly because I wanted to learn juicy gossip about what it was like to teach at Berkeley in the 60s. You know, students streaking into the classroom with no clothes on and, you know, all that kind of wild stuff. But I also kind of wanted to know where they came from. And a number of them really had been, you know, working class people or people raised in the trades who had then gone into the army and then or in the war and had gone to graduate school afterwards. And there's a whole generation of people in my fields, at least, of the kind of post World War II generation, many of whom came from fairly modest backgrounds, quite modest backgrounds actually, and who became in some cases famous, very distinguished scholars.
Exactly.
Many of them Jewish. But that's
Well, except that
disappeared.
there were still quotas
Yeah,
on
there were still
Jews,
quotas, right? Yeah,
and it was not that easy for
yeah, yeah.
Jews after the
No, it
war,
was certainly not. Yeah, of course not.
you know, to say the least.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, I have actually a few more minutes here, and I have a whole page full of questions.
Aha.
um, because my concern has always been, well, how can we improve things?
Yeah.
And one of the issues is 20 years ago in the Academic Senate, I even forget the name of the committee. It was supposed to be about diversity,
Hmm.
except that what was really meant by diversity and the narrow lens of ethnicity and race, the problems are much the same, and then plus a double whammy if you happen to be a working class
Yeah.
African American.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was something no one would talk about.
I think that's really important, and that's why this question of public versus privates, at least to me, seems so important because working class African Americans and working class Latinos are going to go to public universities by and large, and so they need to be able to get into top graduate schools in order to diversify the professoriate.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
We completely agree. But my issue is the reluctance of the institution, let me put it that way, although
Yeah.
that's an artifact,
Yeah.
the small people within the institution
Yeah.
to really recognize the problem.
Yeah.
And so my question to you is, what perhaps could we do to elevate this as a problem so that it penetrates the consciousness and maybe slightly affects the behavior of existing faculty? That's a small question in 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for giving me an easy question. I really appreciate that one. Well, as I did say from a policy perspective, it would be lovely if we had a fellowship program in the graduate division that would target and welcome students from the other UCs and Cal States. And that would be fantastic because that would be focused on the state of California and on serving the state of California. I mean, I would think if I were some sort of gazillionaire out there listening to this seminar, I would immediately run to the bank and write a large check to UC Berkeley to fund that, because that seems to me to be a way in which we can be serving our own system in a certain kind of way. So that's at a policy level. You're right. The cultural question is much more difficult, and I think we could be having more conversations like this one in terms of sort of panels and maybe study groups to think about this a bit more aggressively, and maybe we should be writing about this a bit more aggressively. And if Berkeley can become this kind of vehicle of social advancement, which we are for undergraduates,
Right.
but less so for graduates, then we'll be cooking with gas, as they say, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that's a nice note to end with.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to everybody for tuning in and letting me talk. And I hope that was somewhat interesting and useful.
Well, I thank you very much. Also, on behalf of CSAG, it was a very interesting talk indeed, and perhaps it could be another paper.
We'll hope so. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.